And one last thing, just before I hand over to Aileen, as I said, rather than go around the whole group introducing ourselves, which will be interesting for us, but probably quite time consuming, I wonder if everyone just could use the chat box and just pop in your name, where you're based, and if you're happy to share your email address, then it just means that we can let you know the when dates are approaching for the rest of the series. You can then ignore it if you wish to, but at least you have the opportunity to attend. So if you could use the chat box for that. And I'm going to hand over to Aileen to start our first webinar.
Thanks so much, Hugh. And I am delighted to be starting this off this morning. And once you've kind of popped your details there in the chat box, like Hugh said, it's lovely for us to see where you're coming from in terms of your own clinical and academic careers, what professions you are in. And I suppose the main thing is to recognize the Incubator as this really lovely group of people who want to support you in these endeavors. And I can't tell you what a privilege it's been to be part of that and to be watching what's going on as well. If there was anything I could do in life, it would be to mimic exactly this in our own context here in Ireland as well. So I think what we wanted to do today was to make sure that you get a sense of what we mean when we talk about clinical education research, which means slightly different things to different people. And these are the types of conversations that I think when you're in a room, we like to open up with, but a little more difficult to do on Zoom, and particularly when you're all getting to know not just each other, but getting to know us as well. So we'll create some space for those conversations today as well. So as Hugh said, I think all of us have had very different journeys into clinical education research. And I think it would probably be fair to say that most of us fell into it a little bit serendipitously. Not sure if it was certainly on my career plan when I was maybe 20. I was a physiotherapist originally in what seems like a lifetime ago or another life. And I fell into clinical teaching when I started managing clinical placements for the Royal College of Surgeons in Dublin. And as I was doing that, it suddenly became clear to me that there were no resources for our clinical teachers in physiotherapy. And so I somehow found my way into faculty development, and working with a colleague in medicine, we started teaching teachers. It spun from there, and long story, very long story made very short. I did my PhD in postgraduate medical education, looking at workplace-based assessments. And my mission, it seems, in life has been to create spaces for meaningful feedback and those critical conversations that we have in health professions education, but also in that multidisciplinary forum. And I think this is the beauty of the Incubator and what it brings. And the unfortunate issue is that clinical education research, people aren't really too sure sometimes what that means coming in from the outside. So we wanted to demystify that a little bit today, and to also talk about what we mean by research in that context. So I'm going to pop up my slides, and I have to say with a caveat that these are purely just for me because I tend to lose my train of thought quite quickly. So I just want to make sure that I come back to where I intended to be. And can you see my slides there? Yep, great. You know the way Zoom does this funny thing then where you can't see people once you put up your slides, but I'm going to just try and see, can I see you all a little bit? So I guess where do you start with all these things? Defining what clinical education research is has been one of the core missions and functions of the Incubator Gel, I think it's fair to say, in terms of trying to bring together what is that meaning that we all interpret from this term and put it into something that's operational, or at least that we can operationalize. So what the Incubator's definition is that research which has the understanding or evaluation of any aspect of clinical education as a primary focus. As you're sitting there, you're probably thinking of initiatives you've been involved in and what kind of research you've maybe read in this space. But critically, and I'm going to get Megan to talk about this in a minute, because Megan's done some huge work in this space as well, about what is research as opposed to other forms of scholarship. And I think it's important for me that we recognize, particularly in the context of the work that I publish in the Clinical Teacher, that scholarship is probably the continuum. It's this umbrella term that takes in research, evaluation, quality improvement, curriculum development, These are all scholarly ways in which we contribute to the quality of teaching and learning in health professions, thereby improving the quality of what we do. But in order to do all of those improvement pieces, to understand how to design a curriculum, to understand what we put in it, and critically how we deliver it in the most meaningful and impactful way, we need that research base to do that. And that's where, you know, that's a similar context to clinical research, that, you know, those backgrounds from which you've all been trained probably as well, you know, with clinical research. We use that evidence as our base for determining how we then deliver these education programs as well. So critically, all research starts with a question: what works for whom, why, how, in what context? As opposed to other forms of scholarship, say like, you know, curriculum development and evaluation of its impact. So we look at learner satisfaction, and we look at, you know, are people integrating their learning into practice, those quality improvement initiatives. But this piece of research really seeks to understand how and why that might be meaningful or impactful. And I think that's probably one of those, if Megan, is it fair to use, I'm not sure if we're allowed to use threshold concepts, but I think it's one of the real cornerstones of clinical education research, is understanding what research is. And I can preach about this all morning, but actually it's just about going to read this research, isn't it? Megan, do you want to hop in there? I'm just interested in your thoughts. And again, these workshops over time, and as you all get to know each other, will become much more of a conversation. I know today is us having a conversation, but I'm hoping everyone will join in that. So Megan, do you want to jump in there at all? Because I know this is really your space.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Aileen. So I think one of the things that I felt when I first started out in clinical education research is that there's a lot of different terms for a lot of different things. And I think that the terminology can be quite confusing. So one of the things that we actually did, and this was a key activity of the incubator through the last couple of years, actually, it was quite a body of work to bring together, is we spent a lot of time thinking about what the common and useful kind of key terms were, and how we might go about defining them, kind of bringing in experts from throughout the incubator to essentially weigh in. So I don't know if you want me to talk a little bit about the kind of process of that now, Aileen, or if you want me to.
Yeah, no, I think that fits right beautifully there, Megan. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I can post the link to this in the chat. This is it's a publication in Clinical Teacher, which everyone knows Aileen is the editor of. And that should be an open access link, so people should be able to access that. But I'll pop the PDF into the chat once I've finished rambling on about it. So what we did is create a glossary essentially. And we did that to address the need for that consistent communication within clinical education research. So we felt and feel that effective communication is really critical to sort of moving the discipline forward, to making sure that we all know what each other is speaking about. And we're a very interdisciplinary field as well. Obviously, you know, we're physiotherapists, I'm an ex-doctor, we've got practicing doctors, we've got people who come from science backgrounds, lots of different professions. And that makes it even more essential on the same page, research, scholarship, evaluation, within clinical education. So the creation of the glossary was really driven by that need. And we hoped that having a more standardized set of terms, obviously we appreciate the boundaries of those terms are sometimes contested, they're a little fluid, those terms will evolve, and we hope that the glossary will evolve and change and shift as things in the field move. We hope that it would just help understanding of be a kind of reference. So there's actually, I think there's 172 terms in the glossary, so it's quite extensive. There are qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods terms that cross different approaches. So really the idea was that it was there, and it's sort of searchable through that publication if anyone is interested in you know, a definition, and each of the terms also has a key foundation text, so it can be used as a sort of springboard to further reading and understanding as well. I've been talking for long enough now, Aileen, but if there's anything specific about it that you want me to talk about, please do let me know.
No, that's super. And I think the reason we wanted to introduce the lexicon today, this glossary of terms, is, you know, when you start thinking about the literature that everyone's going to signpost you towards in November, and then even towards writing a research question, all of these terms are going to come up in your research. And the main thing I want you to really go away from today remembering is that it can be overwhelming. So don't be overwhelmed. Try and make sure that you recognize that this is a language that we as a community are quite familiar with, but it's our role to help you understand that language as well. So, you know, just things will become much clearer after they become quite unclear, let's be fair. And I think what we'll do is push you into a space maybe that's a little bit less comfortable for the next while, but I do promise you it will all come together eventually. I always think back to physiology in my second year, and somebody said that, you know, it'll become clear at the end of the year. The year went on for quite a long time, and I'm not sure how much clearer it got, but, you know, that's our role, is to try and help you to clear that up as well. But when we talk about research, I guess one of the things that people struggle with a little bit coming into, particularly from very strong clinical research backgrounds, is qualitative research. And again, I just wanted to kind of briefly mention today, I suppose, my take on what clinical research looks like. Now, this graphic worked perfectly yesterday, and there's not a hope of it working here today. But this is my very simplistic notion of when we talk about research terms, and we talk about quantitative versus qualitative, and you'll get into these debates about the position for both and the value of both in clinical education research. But I like to think of quantitative research, so things like surveys or pieces like that that give you the jigsaw frame outline. Okay, so if we think about research as a picture, my simplistic take is that the size of that frame is going to determine how big this picture is. So sometimes things like a survey will give you the size of that outline. So if you have a rectangular jigsaw, the more pieces you have and the wider it is, the more you need to fill this in a little bit. So then we start to put this color on it in here in the middle with all these hands trying to work out where all these pieces fit in to create a sense of the shape. Then we create this 3D model. And again, this is my piece that worked perfectly yesterday. Do you think it would work here now? This spins on its own axis, this blue one, when it's not on a share screen. And then we get a sense of how it spins and pivots because we look at it from different angles. And that's where all this qualitative research comes in. That's the richness that we bring, where we start looking at narratives. We start looking at diverse narratives, where we're not looking maybe for a single truth in something, but actually each individual's truth. And I'll talk a little bit more about the terms that we use to describe that. And so we've got this shape now that's spinning, if it was working for me, spinning on its own axis, but we can look at it from different angles. But then we start to put even richer narratives on this. And we do things like studies where the researcher becomes embedded in the particular world or the context in which the research is being conducted. And now you have what is here a 2D shape that then becomes 3D. And suddenly you start to look at it from different angles, and you can move it and you can spin it. And those are the angles and the perspectives we take on our research that allow us to look at things from different angles as well. And that's why this lexicon is so important to us as well. And I think the fact that Megan and Gabs and the team were able to bring together what is a huge number of terms and try to bring some collective understanding of each term will help us to be consistent as a field in how we present our work. So that's a key reference for today, but it's the one to have with you. And I purposely haven't, kind of put in lots of references today, but I do want to introduce you to some literature that will help guide you as you start to understand what clinical education research is. A lot of what we do has been adapted from sociology, from psychology, from various different aspects of education, from primary education. So my work, as I say, was in workplace-based assessment. A huge amount of that work was actually done in primary school teaching. And so when you can bring these other lenses to it that are from outside the field of health professions, we get that richer picture of what's going on as well. These are some of the keywords, and part of me, I thought today about sending you off on a treasure hunt through the glossary to find these terms, but I think it might be a bit much for our first session today. These are some key terms that you're going to come across. They're also going to be the keywords that lead you to very contested spaces. And also to very rich understandings of the lenses that we use in our research in clinical education. But the two I want to draw your eye to are ontology and epistemology. And the reason is because I had to look up those definitions for at least 5 years every time I came across them to pretend that I remembered the difference between them. So ontology is this: what do you think is the nature of reality? Is there a reality? Is everyone's truth the same? Or can you live in this gray space that we call, where you understand this constructivist nature of reality, that everybody's reality is slightly different? And as researchers, that can be a little bit different. We're all trained in clinical research, where the RCT is at the top of that hierarchy. Well, the meta-analysis is at the top of the hierarchy, the systematic review, but the RCT is the gold standard, right? We can confound for all our variables and try and limit those and work out, does this particular drug work? Does this tool do what it's supposed to do? In educational research, it becomes a little more muddy. People learn in different ways. They remember things in different ways. Educational initiatives have different impacts for different people. So trying to work out if something works in education actually is not always the most appropriate question, and actually probably quite seldom is the right question to be asking. Instead of which, our questions become, how do we know how people learn, how this has been impactful, what works for whom, why, what context, and we try and infer what we're going to move to next. Now, that's not to say we don't take a lot from educational psychology, where we use, very positivist methods, but at the same time, it's understanding that this is really rich world of research approaches from which to draw on for our own particular research questions. And just to say again, I want to reinforce that this starts with the question. That's what research is, right? So even when we talk about clinical research, I look at papers, I look at hundreds of papers every week that come into the journal, and I'm constantly amazed at the number of papers that come in without an actual defined research question. And it can be a subtle difference. People say, but I said I was going to explore. I'm like, yeah, but exploring it throws that quite wide open. If you're going to do a research study, refining that down to a research question means you can much better align the whole study to that. And you'll talk a lot about that when it comes to writing a research question. But that's the key thing to remember, that research starts with an actual research question. And then we have our language that we use here. So I think that might be a good time to maybe get you talking a little bit, because we've done a little bit of it there, and then we'll come back again. One of the things, obviously, that the world has been made a better place by the presence of Zoom is that we can bring people together for an hour. You don't have to travel to come and do this once a month. But the downside is we don't get to have the chats, and we miss that a little bit. So we want to create that space for you to do that. We'll create a little short space today, but I would like you to start meeting each other. This is going to be your community, and possibly for a lot of you, your first entry into clinical education research and our little gang, our tribe. And it's nice to get to know people and see what everybody else is up to. So we're going to pop you into some breakout rooms, just small groups. In GP training, we talk a lot about the 60-second, letting a patient talk for 60 seconds. I don't know if you know, but that's extremely difficult to do. People have to literally sit on their hands and be quiet for a whole 60 seconds is the exercise. But trying to introduce yourself in 60 seconds is also probably quite a skill. Your own research interests, what brought you here today? How did you even think about getting started in clinical education research and explore it? And now, given what we've talked about, have a think about not necessarily your ontology and epistemology, but just more about, how do you like to approach research at the moment? Do you like those facts and figures? Do you think you could live in the gray area of uncertainty? How do you manage that yourself? And do you like to hear stories and narratives? And this will help you as you work through the series to try and think about the types of research that you might like to be involved in. There is no one size fits all. There's no expectation that when you come to clinical education research that everyone is going to do qualitative research, everyone's going to do quantitative research. What you'll do is you'll find your particular zone in which you're comfortable, but hopefully you'll also find the zones in which you're not that comfortable, and we might nudge you into those a little bit more as well without making it too scary. Every month you'll get to meet new people within those breakout rooms, and possibly form those connections too. There are a couple of things. I'm just going to pop this slide actually back on for 1 second, because I want to show you some key things. I did want you to go away with something today. And so what I have is a series of papers that I think are probably the most important ones for you to have nearby. Not for you necessarily to read right now, but these ones that, someday you're going to go, oh, actually, she did mention something about that. It might be handy to look at there as well. Okay. Here we go. So this is our lexicon. And I'm going to admit, obviously, I wasn't involved at the beginning when this was being mooted, and Megan and Gabs gathered the team together and did this absolutely huge amount of work to think about all the terms that we use in clinical education that need defining. But just to say why they need defining. And it's because A, this didn't exist, but B, people use different terms in different ways, but they also tend to use them interchangeably. And there can be a lot of confusion. So you could read 2 published constructivist grounded theory papers, possibly in the same journal, and they will have done things quite differently. And while A, that's the nature of a lot of qualitative research, is we do have a little bit of wriggle room. Some people might call it methodological mixing. I know there was a workshop recently at a conference, and it was called, do they call it paradigmatic promiscuity or methodological promiscuity? Anyway, it's just this way of kind of just realizing that while there are methods and defined methods, sometimes it's not as black and white as we think in terms of the process. And so it can be difficult for you as a new researcher to say, well, look, they have 2 grounded theory papers here and they're both doing things a little bit differently. How does that work? So we needed those terms to kind of bring us together to see what these mean to different people in different contexts as well. So this, I think, should be your go-to paper, as in you have it there saved on your laptop, and every time you come across a term in a paper that you've read in a new term, then you have something to actually look it up as well. And that's what we've been missing. So when I heard this was being developed, of course, I said, oh, and clinical teacher might like to publish that. Can you bring it to me, please? So thankfully they did, because it is in an open access forum, which again is really important for these types of papers too. Then I'm going to do a serious plug for this clinical teacher virtual issue on qualitative research. I was involved in this series long before I was involved in the journal, and Karen Mattick brought a bunch of us together to write this series for exactly this group. And it was for people like me at the time who were really at that start of getting involved in qualitative research, which can be a bit of a mystery. These are short, snappy, bite-sized how-to papers. They're freely available on the website too in the virtual issues, and that's the link directly to the whole list. So there are, I think, 10 papers in the end, and various aspects of qualitative research. Again, you can access these as and when you need them. So we have one on writing a research question that you can dip into for the next session. There's ones on reflexivity, explaining how to do data analysis, the various different ways we do that in qualitative research. So these are all like freely available, easy access resources. And when I say accessible, I don't just mean in the context of them being open access, but I mean in terms of the language that we used for those. These are written particularly for people who are new to qualitative research. So the language in them has all been really, I suppose, very specifically oriented to people who are new to this field as well. The third one is probably a little bit more challenging reading. It tries to bring in a lot, but it's more of a reference paper to, again, some definitions around things like paradigms, ontology, epistemology, axiology, things that you'll see in papers to different extents. You know, I think that's fair to say, Megan, isn't it? You know, people kind of are explicit sometimes in their papers about their worldview, which is a paradigm, how you see the world, how you see reality, and sometimes not so much. And we probably have gotten to a point where we criticize more the people who aren't that explicit about it. Do you think? Would that be a fair point?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think the thing to say is that even if someone isn't explicit about it, usually they have this worldview, and they're just, yeah, like you said, Aileen, they're just not discussing it or telling you about it. So even if, you know, they might have assumed that it's not important or that it's not relevant to them, but this is actually relevant to everybody in all types of research. It is a really good starting point. But yeah, I think working through some of the more introductory material then can lead you into the more in-depth theories, like number 3 on the screen. It's kind of a nice progression because it's a lot of new information, new terms, and philosophical language that can feel a bit it can be a little bit overwhelming when you start, but I think that's natural and normal as well as part of that process of getting to grips with this new way of thinking.
And I think I'm quite conscious too, and Megan, you probably recognize it, you know, so much has changed, hasn't it, Hugh, in the last kind of probably 15, 20 years, but the last 10 in particular, I think certainly since I came into clinical education research and qualitative research, in terms of how much we have borrowed and taken from philosophy and how much we've gotten to grips with, to the point where we publish a lot of work now that is at a level that can be quite difficult to read when you're new to the field, but is sort of seen as an ultimate target. And I'm not sure that that's really equitable. But these are debates and you know, discussions that we can have throughout the series. But the point I want to make is that we all started somewhere and that this field has evolved particularly quickly. So don't expect to get to grips with these things very quickly. And your worldview I would be surprised if it didn't change in the next 6 months. We hope it will in some ways. But to kind of not be afraid to challenge yourself, but don't be disappointed. And again, you know, everybody's a high achiever in terms of clinical careers and clinical practice. And don't be, you know, upset when this isn't immediately clear. This isn't a feature of you not being able to understand it. This is a feature of how quickly this field has evolved and how differently we've started thinking in this space. Do you think that's a fair, Hugh, a fair advice to have about not being overwhelmed?
Absolutely. And I think whatever our backgrounds, whether it's kind of medicine or nursing or veterinary science, we often are taught in quite a scientific manner rather than a social science background. And so a lot of it is language and just getting, actually these are, you know, looking at that third paper, I think before I'd started, I'd be like, well, I don't even understand most of the terms in the title, let alone the actual paper. And that would have put me off. But actually, once you get through, I don't think it's necessarily even a barrier. It seems like a barrier. But once you get through that, we have it the same in our own specialities, won't we? We'll use terms and abbreviations that only those in our specialty will understand. So it's very similar. But it is really, really rewarding once you do get through the terminologies and the language. And I think for me, I'm not going to say, oh, it changed my life getting into medical education research, but it certainly opened my eyes and my understanding of just how I look at life and the world, as well as actually how I go about research. So I highly recommend getting your head around it.
And I think obviously for me, the most unbelievable part of being in clinical education research in various guises has been the community I've met and the people I've worked with. And, you know, I didn't set out 20 years ago to be editor-in-chief of the Clinical Teacher. I can tell you that was on a bucket list, but I didn't think it was going to happen anytime soon. And that the rewards of being involved in such a community where everyone literally does pay it forward is quite unique and something to be very much part of. And Jill, I might bring you in at this stage because Jill's been part of this change, I think, over time as well. And I don't know if you remember, I remember starting out and we thought we were great because we did pre and post tests of knowledge when we gave people something. We taught them something they didn't know and thought we were amazing that they actually learned it. And we know, you know, as a field, that this idea of pre and post testing, as we do in clinical practice, it doesn't actually translate to educational research. That's one of the ways in which the field has significantly moved on. And you won't see much of that published. Well, maybe you will, but you won't see too much of that kind of thing published anymore. We look for deeper levels of evaluation, don't we, about how much things have impacted on learning and ultimately, hopefully, on people's practice as well. Jill, would you like to jump in there?
I totally agree, actually, and I think it's the untapped opportunities to look for deeper effects and impact on practice and behaviour, and considering the value of longitudinal research to be following participants through and understanding the longer term effects of some of those teaching strategies, for sure.
So I thought I might just wrap up with a little bit of homework, because I think one of the challenges of getting involved in a series like this is, you know, it's hard to commit to things like this. It's not like you have to be at every one of these and you'll dip in and out, but it would be nice to connect one to the next. So the next one you're going to talk about is about reading the literature, isn't it? Is that the next one, Hugh? It's the next one, isn't it? It's getting started in reviewing the literature. So this is where you're going to start reading papers and trying to work out what conversations are actually taking place on various different topics. What are the hot topics in clinical education research at the moment? So what I thought I might ask you to do is to just think about, now that we've kind of brought you into this area, I thought I might ask you to just read one paper a week. You know, so much is open access now, which is great. So even if you get into medical education, clinical teacher, medical teacher, you'll find articles that are open access. Otherwise, you should have access to them through your own individual libraries and other forums as well. But there's plenty of open access research there as well. But even if you took one paper a week from a different health professions education journal, these are just some of the ones you might recognize very quickly. There are others, obviously. And every time now, instead of just reading the abstract and reading what they set out to do and the conclusion, but we all kind of do, to be fair, try and see if you delve into it a tiny bit more. Think about Megan's glossary. think about those words that we've kind of highlighted there, even on the slide a little while ago too. Can you actually see, do these people articulate a research question? So I can tell you as an editor and all my reviewers and associate editors, when a paper comes in, into a research section, we look for a research question. And it won't always be visible and easy to find. Sometimes it says we set out to explore, we set out to understand, whatever it might be. See, can you identify within that a research question that is at least embedded and to which all of those methodological approaches are aligned? See, can you understand what they did to collect their data and how they analyzed it? You won't understand all of those. And that's what this series will help you to do as well, is to think through those data analysis methods that are, again, possibly going to be quite new to you. But think about that reflexivity that Megan and I just spoke about, that sense of actually articulating where you are in relation to the research itself. So we talk a little bit about maybe being an insider. So if you're a GP trainee, looking at how GP trainees explore certain concepts within their training, or if you are an educator trying to understand how faculty appreciate or do different things. I'm sorry, I think so to read those papers with those different types of lenses now as well. But this is my unasked for advice to wrap up with today as well, before we take some questions. It's always good to have unasked for advice, right? Make friends, reach out, start asking questions, start finding out what's going on at your institutions, at your organizations. Is there a health professions education? Probably a med ed journal club is probably what it would be called. Or is medical education something that could be incorporated into your own journal clubs as well every now and again? Read. That's all you can do, is try and get familiar with the conversations that are happening and how they're happening. What kind of research is one journal publishing that maybe another isn't? And that's a conversation that we're going to have in May around getting your work ready for publication, because you do need to think about it from the beginning. I think a lot of new clinical teachers get this advice saying, oh, you did a great thing there. That was really good. You should write that up. There are inherent challenges with trying to publish something after the fact and thinking about publishing after the fact. So try and embed that from the beginning as well. Just a technical note, you can get the table of contents sent to you for every journal when it's released. So you just sign up for the table of contents. I find that really helpful, just to get a sense of what's going on at I won't say the competition, but at other journals, and to use the ClinEdWord directory. This again is one of the huge, I suppose, impacts of this incubator, is that the team has created a directory of people who are interested in supervising, coaching, mentoring, and advising early career researchers, PhD students, working with you to work out what your interests are as well. Our particular research and scholarship interests are listed on that, so you can reach out to people if you want to have discussion about, potentially creating your master's project or your PhD or your postdoc, for maybe advice on funding. Jill, would you like to, I'm going to stop sharing this and I'm going to just try and fix my screen here. Jill, do you want to add anything about the directory? Because it is a particularly important aspect of the incubator's outputs as well.
Yeah, no, the directory is, the directory is evolving, and I think you're quite right. It's a really useful tool to identify individuals who are working across the UK around their expertise, and who are willing to share that expertise with the new starters to clinical education research. So I guess practically, if you're not if you're new to the incubator, please do share today's sessions with the people that you work with, including senior staff in the organization, because it'd be great to connect with your senior colleagues to populate the directory so that we can continue to build this community of practice.